Let's begin our discussion by talking about all the free stuff that there is out there from the government these days. Free stuff everywhere, free stuff. A quick search of the internet will reveal a litany and a list of free things from the government that would make a Hollywood actress blush. If you want it, you can have free money for your education. You can get a free cell phone. You can get a free down payment on your home. You can get free energy types of equipment, free solar panels. There's really no end to what you can get from the government. The government even promotes and advertises its benefits. This is a screenshot here of a USA.gov government benefit website where you see on the left hand side there you see affordable rental housing, benefits, financial aid for students, food assistance, grant and loans, help with bills. There is virtually nothing that you can buy on the market that is not offered for free by the government today. And in fact, the government continues to expand these programs. We've heard in the recent months talk about free tuition. We've heard about talk of repayment of student aid debt, so free college based on repaying your student loans for zero. We've got all kinds of free government stuff. But the question is all of this really free? Does this sound too good to be true? Well, in point of fact, it is too good to be true. All this free stuff has to be paid for by someone, and that someone is a lot closer to home than most people think. So tonight we want to take up this issue of free government programs. How is the government giving all of this money away? Where is all this money coming from, all these benefits and all these programs? We also want to talk about free stuff from the perspective of stimulus plans. We know this week the government passed another stimulus plan, the third of the last year for COVID-related stimulus. And we want to talk about that as well and understand, is that free money really free, or is there more to it than it seems? So the session tonight will have two key topics. Number one, we'll talk about the dangers of free stuff, that's free government programs, free giveaways from the government, and that'll be from Chapter 7 of the book, Chapter 7, Key Takeaways. And then we want to talk about the basics of stimulus plans. How do stimulus plans work? Are they effective? And what are the problems related to stimulus plans? We'll talk about that. That is from Chapter 8, Key Takeaways. So let's go ahead and get started then with the dangers of free stuff. Chapter 7, Key Takeaways. First of all, let's connect this free stuff that the government keeps giving out and wanting to give out more. Let's connect that to socialism. How is it that all of this free stuff that we've already talked about is connected to the move of the nation towards socialism? Well, there are a couple of ways that it's connected. The first is in income and wealth redistribution. So you remember we said that the goal of socialism is to make everybody equal, so there's no rich and everybody shares equally in the resources of the society. Well, giving away free stuff, as we'll see, that money has to come from somewhere. So that free stuff is going from one set of people to another set of people. So we are redistributing the income and the wealth. So it is an instrument of socialism to continue to take from one group and give to another. But also, free stuff from the government is connected to socialism in that it starts to create dependence upon the government by people. People stop looking to God, looking to each other, looking to themselves to provide, and they start looking to government. And that is exactly what the socialist wants. The socialist believes that the government is number one, that the government is all-powerful, the government is the place that everybody should go. And so when we start giving away stuff, people start to come to the government for more and more things, and they become more dependent upon government. And that is exactly what the socialist wants to happen. So we're seeing socialism play out in our nation right now as we see more and more calls for free stuff. But my question for you is it really free? Is free stuff really free? We think about things coming from the government as being free, but is that the case? Let's take the example of student loans. The federal government will pay the interest on student loans. They are called federally subsidized loans for undergraduate students. And so if you take out a loan to pay for your associate's degree or your bachelor's degree, in many cases the government will pay that interest for you and you don't have to pay it. It's interest free from your perspective. So in a sense, your school loans are free. But are they really free? Let's use this as an example to understand where all this free stuff comes from. So let's say that you have a student loan and you take out a student loan of $10,000. That's how much you borrow to pay for your classes. And the interest rate on that loan is 4%. So in a year's time with simple interest, that would mean that you would owe $400 in interest on that loan every year that you had it. If you have delayed payment, so you weren't repaying the principal, you'd owe $400 a year until you started paying that back. So that's $400 in interest. Well, the question is, who pays for this? Where does that interest come from? If it's from the government, if it's a government program for interest-free student loans, does that mean that it just vanishes into the air and nobody pays it? It just kind of magically happens. That's not what happens. The federal government pays that interest. The government every month, to cover your interest, writes a check to pay that interest. So then you have to ask yourself, where does the government get this money? Where does government get money? Again, you would think that we wouldn't have to talk about these kinds of things, but people don't know today where government actually gets its income. People think government just gets it from nowhere, or government just prints money. But the government, while they physically do print money, they do not make up money out of the air. That's a very dangerous thing to do. We'll talk about that some other time. So the government has to get that money from one of two places. The government gets the money from taxes, that is individual taxes from people like me and you, or taxes on corporations, or from debt, from borrowing the money. Those are the only two places the government can get money. Now the government does get a little bit of money from things like tariffs and fees and things like that. But by and large, the government gets most of its money from taxes and debt. Well, let's take a little bit closer look at where the government gets its money. In 2019, this is a pie chart here to show you the relationship between the government income from taxes and government income from borrowing in 2019. So let's look at 2019. In 2019, the government, of all of its spending, 77% was from its income in taxes. The other 23%, and that comes from people like me and you, those who are working and paying taxes, the other 23% it borrowed. So if you had a student loan and you had free interest on your student loans, the government paid 77% of that interest, of that $400, out of the income it got from taxes. And the other 23% it borrowed. So only in America could this happen, that we are actually borrowing money to pay interest on your debt. And now we have to pay interest on that debt because we're paying off your debts. 77% comes from income, which would be taxes, and 23% from debt. But let's look at this from another angle. Let's say that your student loan was held by a bank, and the government came along and told the bank it could not charge you interest on those loans. Let's say something came along like a pandemic, for example, and the government told a bank that held your loan on your student debt that for a period of 6 months or a year it could not charge you interest. In a sense then, you would have, again, free interest, free loans. But is that really free? Let's look at this now. What happens if the government doesn't allow a bank to charge interest on loans it has to you? What are the repercussions of this? First of all, banks make money by charging you interest. So when a bank can't charge you interest, it loses its income, its revenue, and eventually it could close down. So if a bank is doing most of its business in student loans, for example, then it would lose all of its revenue right away because it couldn't charge you interest, and that bank would have to fold. On the other hand, in order to keep that bank from folding, the U.S. government would have to give that bank money for the time being. And remember where it gets that money. It gets that money from taxes and borrowing. So we have the same problem over and over. But banks can close down if the government does not let that bank charge you interest. So that money is not free. Let's say that a bank who has student loans as a portion of its business also has a big portion of its business in other things, like let's say credit cards or home improvement loans or mortgages. Well, to offset the losses that it would take for not being able to charge you interest on your loans, it would have to raise the rates that it charged on the rest of its customers to make up that difference. It couldn't just not do anything. It would have to make up that money somewhere. So it would raise rates on things like credit cards, mortgages, second mortgages, and that kind of thing. And then think about this. If the government comes along and starts telling banks that it can't charge interest on student loans, we talked about rational self-interest in our last session, what are other banks likely to do? Well, this particular bank is probably just going to say, look, long term, we need to get out of loaning money to students because the federal government can come along and basically cut our revenue right out from under us. So that bank may, over time, get out of the student loan business altogether. And then other banks that may be looking for other lines of business will say, hey, we were thinking about going into student loans, but the government just took away all the revenue from these banks, and many of them closed up, and it caused a tremendous amount of problem. So we're just going to stay out of student loans altogether. So notice what has happened here because the government tried to give you free student loans, free stuff. Is it really free? No, it's not free. Look what happens. Businesses close because you get free stuff. Other customers pay higher rates and higher prices because you get free stuff. And then there are shortages of things that people need because the government gave you something for free. So you see all of these repercussions of you getting free stuff. So there is no such thing as free stuff. Now, if you're paying attention, you should notice this, recognize this from our last session. Does this sound familiar? It should sound familiar because these are the same negative results as price controls. Remember when we talked about the government coming in and saying you can't charge but so much for a prescription drug, and we looked at all the ramifications of that, what played out because of that. We looked at the things that played out because of high minimum wages, which is a price floor. Remember that? You can't go below that price. So you see this when the government gets involved in the market and when it interferes in the free choices of buyers and sellers, then these negative repercussions are always the outcome. So this doesn't work. This is a negative thing. Well, why do I bring up about this example about the government potentially telling a bank it couldn't charge you interest? Because the federal government is doing that right now to many types of businesses in order to protect people from the pandemic. The government, you can't say that it's necessarily a bad thing. They're not necessarily trying to do a bad thing by telling people that they can't charge for certain things during the pandemic. But the repercussions of the government doing these things could be catastrophic. This is a CNBC article headline here, which says, most evictions in the U.S. are now banned, what you need to know. So the government has come along and it's said in this legislation, the stimulus legislation, it's saying that people cannot evict you from your home if you don't pay your rent. If you don't pay your rent on your apartment or your condo, they can't evict you. Well, what is that? That is basically saying that you don't have to pay your rent. You don't have to pay your rent. The government's coming along and telling a landlord, a landowner, that he cannot collect rent. When you tell people they can't get evicted, what are they going to do? Rational self-interest. If they have no integrity like most Americans today, they're just not going to pay their rent because there's nothing you can do about it. So what happens? The man or woman who owns that apartment or that complex, they lose their revenue. What happens? They go out of business. They have to charge higher prices on other things, and there are shortages of apartments and those kinds of things as well. So you see, this is what's going on right now. And the government is getting involved in these things and telling people they can't charge for their items. So the question then becomes here, when we get into some situation where the economy is not doing well, take this pandemic. Things have gone south in a big way. I mean, we basically closed down the country for the better part of a year. And so there's going to be suffering, economic suffering. People are going to lose money. People are going to lose jobs. People are going to lose out. The question in a recession or a depression is not if someone is going to lose. It's who is going to lose. Who should suffer when the economy goes south? And what the government is trying to do by not allowing, for example, building owners, apartment owners to evict people is it's saying that the apartment owners have to suffer, but the tenants do not have to suffer. Is that the right way to do this? Who should suffer when the economy goes south? Somebody is going to suffer, but who should suffer? Let me give you a quote from the book about how we should look at who should suffer when the economy turns south. Each person should suffer based on his own choices and his own area of responsibility. If you chose to take out a student loan, you are responsible to make the payments even when the economy goes south. You cannot go to the government for relief when you can't make those payments. Similarly, if a bank chose to lend you money and you cannot repay it, the bank is responsible to deal with the lost income that comes from your non-payment. It cannot go to the government for relief based on a decision it made. If we do not allow these consequences to fall as they naturally would, and this is very important, we will make the problem worse down the line and bankrupt our government in the process. Here's the thing. In a pandemic, if you don't have the money to pay your rent, that's your fault, and that is your responsibility. It's not the landowner's responsibility. If during a pandemic you don't have the money to pay your student loans, that is your fault. That is not the government's fault. That is not my fault. That is not the bank's fault. It is your fault. So when we have these situations, we cannot have the governments moving around who suffers, because all they're doing is shifting this suffering and causing even more suffering. You have to take responsibility for your own self, and a little later in another session we're going to talk about the need to prepare for difficult times beforehand so you don't need to go to the government. But we have to suffer based on our own choices and our own area of responsibility. But what about some other problems with free stuff? When the government starts providing things for free, providing not only money and products, but services like health care, and the government starts to want to get into and take over more parts of the economy, what are the problems that come up with that? Well, there are three problems that I want to mention to you. The first is the problem of waste. Take the U.S. Postal Service. The U.S. Postal Service is essentially, the government is completely socialist. The government has taken over a sector of the economy, which is sending letters and mail between people in the country. That is a completely socialist concept. The government has taken it over. The government is providing it for people. But the problem is these programs, these kinds of organizations and institutions, they do not have to face the pressures of the market. So they become very wasteful. Per the Government Accountability Office, the Postal Service lost $69 billion from 2007 to 2018. The Postal Service loses money every year. And even though they might compete with UPS and FedEx, for example, on package delivery, they have a complete monopoly on letters and parcels and that kind of thing. So you have the problem of waste. Whenever the government gets involved and takes it over, it will become a wasteful entity, and the taxpayer will have to foot the bill. There's also the problem of quality. Again, the federal government, any government, does not have to face the pure pressures of the market. They have a corner on the market, and they always have somebody behind them to provide more money if they can't make it work. That would be the taxpayer. But consider the problem of quality. Take the VA, the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs. I am a veteran. I've been to the VA hospitals, and I can tell you that the service level there is not like anything that you would get at a facility that you paid, where you paid for your services. This is a very well-known thing. Think about the last time you went to the Department of Transportation or dealt with the IRS. Yes, sometimes it's not as bad as it could be, but there's often foolish processes, long waits, a lot of quality issues. Per USA Today, nearly every VA performed worse than other medical providers on patient satisfaction surveys. So the VA constantly has quality problems because the government has taken it over. When the government takes it over, that's what happens. But then you have the problem of overuse. The problem of overuse, let's use the Canadian healthcare system as an example of that. You might know that Canada provides free healthcare. Canada has a socialist healthcare system. And whenever somebody starts talking about making the U.S. a socialist healthcare system, they always talk about these other places where it's free. But the problem with free stuff is you end up waiting for it. You end up waiting a long time for it. Let's look at Canada's healthcare system. This is a 2019 report on the Canadian healthcare and wait times. The Fraser Institute reported that the average wait time in Canada to receive treatment from a specialist was nearly 21 weeks in 2019, more than 5 months. The wait time to have a consultation with a specialist, not actually receive treatment, was just over 10 weeks, 2.5 months. In the United States, 70% of patients see a specialist in less than 4 weeks, and 61% had a procedure completed within a month. One of the obvious reasons Canadians must wait so long is that healthcare demand is high because nobody has to pay for it. You see, it's just natural. We talked about this, the law of demand. The law of demand says that the lower the price is, the higher the demand is. And when you put the price at zero, people go in and get health care, sign up to get health care reviews, and go in to see the doctor about every little thing because there's nothing to prevent them. There's no hurdle for them to get over to do that. And so you end up with long wait lines. So you have these problems when you get into free stuff that no one thinks about and we don't usually talk about until it's too late. But what is the answer to the free stuff problem? People are calling for more and more free stuff in the United States every day, it seems. More and more free. Want it free, want it free, want it free. What is the answer to free stuff? Well, the Bible gives us some answers to free stuff. And the first answer is to work and pay your own way. The government will, as we'll see later on in this series, the government simply cannot afford and will not be able to continue to pay for all of these things for free. Even a lot of the things we get for free now will not be able to continue into the future. But the Bible has a position on this. The Bible says, look, you're not supposed to be getting from the government anyway. You're supposed to be working and paying your own way. Let's look at a couple of verses on this. 1 Timothy 5:8. But if anyone does not provide for his own, and especially for those of his household, he is denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. What is God saying? He's saying the responsibility to take care of your family is with you, father, and you, mother. You have to provide for this family. It says, but if anyone does not provide for his own, not if anyone does not go to the government and make sure he gets free stuff for his own, he is worse than an infidel. You are worse than an unbeliever if you take advantage of all these government programs and refuse to work. And then 2 Thessalonians 3:10, the Bible even talks a little bit more aggressively about this. Paul says, for even when we were with you, we commanded you this, if anyone will not work, neither shall he eat. You're not supposed to be taking all of this free stuff and not working. The answer to free stuff is for you to work. The second answer the Bible gives is for us to say no to ourselves and to save for what we need. We have completely lost this in our culture. To say no to yourself and to save. I talked about it earlier. In a pandemic, if you can't pay your rent, that's your fault. But how many years have we had without pandemics that you have not been saving money so that you would have the money to pay your rent in a pandemic? You see what we're saying? Proverbs 25:16, saying no to yourself. Have you found honey? Eat only as much as you need, lest you be filled with it and vomit. There are a number of lessons that could be taken from this verse, but one of them is, look, if you've got something good, only take as much as you need and save the rest for later. Say no to yourself. Have you found honey? Eat only as much as you need. Say no and stop yourself. And here's another one on saving. Proverbs 21:20. There is desirable treasure and oil in the dwelling of the wise, but a foolish man squanders it. Foolish man squanders it. So he's not saying no to himself. He's consuming everything that he has, and he ends up without. But the wise man, look at this, there is desirable treasure and oil in the dwelling of the wise. The wise man, the wise woman are going to have stored away that which they need when troubled times come. But all this free stuff keeps us from being wise about that. Free stuff, my friends, is not free. Someone has to pay for it. And the answer to that is to work and pay your own way, and to say no to yourself and to save. Let's talk about now the basics of stimulus plans. The government not only wants to give away things in terms of just direct items like phones and student loans and solar panels. The government is giving away more and more under the auspices of the stimulus plan. Even this week, as you probably all know, there was another stimulus plan passed by Congress, about $2 trillion roughly. That would put the total at somewhere between 5 and 7 trillion that we have used in stimulus money since in 1 year. Just to put that in perspective, it took us over 200 years as a nation to get $5 trillion in the hole. And now we have gone 5 to 7 trillion in the hole in 1 year. So we've got stimulus plans. The first one that I remember, the first time I remember hearing the word stimulus was around 2001, 2002, after 9/11. I believe I got a stimulus. There was a stimulus program from George W. Bush. And then there was another one in 2008, the early stages of the Great Recession. And Obama had one after that, about 2009 or 10. And then, of course, last year we had another one. And in the book, I go through a short history of stimulus plans. But are stimulus plans good? People are calling for these, begging for these. Senators say we have to have them. We need them. The people need them. But do we really need them? Do they work? And what are the downsides of stimulus plans? First of all, let's define what a stimulus plan is. Here's how I'll define it. A stimulus plan is a coordinated effort by the government to pull the economy out of a recession or a depression. It's when the government does a certain set of things to try and get the economy going again. That's the phrase you'll need to get the economy going again. And a stimulus plan has there are a number of things that can be done under the umbrella term of a stimulus plan. Stimulus simply means to stimulate. But there are 6 things, and let's just hit these briefly. We won't spend a lot of time on them. They're pretty self-explanatory. First of all, there's government spending. The government not only will send money to individuals, we'll talk about that in a moment, but they'll buy stuff. They'll buy more tanks, more bombs. They'll buy more things. The government will become basically a bigger customer to businesses to try and get the economy going. And then the government will make cash payments to individuals and to states. I would not be surprised if this last stimulus here is not loaded with money for blue states that have poorly managed their money because they've moved towards socialism and now they need to be bailed out. But the government will give money to individuals and to states. The government will also give money to businesses or make loans to businesses that businesses may not have to pay back. So we have government spending, cash payments to individuals and states. We have cash payments to businesses. There will also be tax cuts sometimes in stimulus plans, reducing the amount that we have to pay out of our weekly paycheck in taxes to give us more money to spend on things in the economy. Also, the government will try and adjust the money supply. They'll make money available for loans more easily, or they'll lower interest rates, that kind of thing, to try and get things going. And then finally, the government will adjust regulation. This is one of the things that President Trump did during his administration, was he cut a lot of the red tape, cut a lot of the rules that companies had to jump through in order to do business. And that the basic idea is that will help a business get going and get the economy going. But if you'll notice here, most of these things have to do with the government either spending money or not taking in as much money in taxes. Government spending is the government putting money out into the economy. Cash payments to individual states and businesses are the government spending money, putting money out into the economy. And tax cuts. Tax cuts are the government saying, you don't have to send me that money, you keep it. So in a way, it's the government reducing its income to give you more money. But what's the logic behind a stimulus plan? Why does the government do these things? Well, in order to understand that, we have to do a little bit of Economics 101 here. Why does the government spend money when the economy is bad? It's not just that little bit of money that the government spends. Now, I know that $2 trillion is a lot of money, but when you've got a $20 trillion economy, $2 trillion is really not that much money. It's only about 10%. So why does the government spend money? Why does the government infuse money into the economy when it gets bad? It's because they believe the money will multiply. It's called the spending multiplier. This is an economics idea that sort of drives the government to do these things, the spending multiplier. The idea is that the money that the government spends, so the government spends $1, will produce more than $1 in the economy. Well, you say, how does that work? Well, let's talk about something else. Let's talk about something called the marginal propensity to consume. Now, I know, don't get afraid of this term. It's actually not very complicated. Marginal propensity to consume, the MPC. All that is, it has to do with when you get $1 as a consumer, how much of that dollar do you spend and how much do you save? So if I give you $1, are you going to take that whole dollar and put it in the bank? Are you going to spend 50 cents and keep 50? What are you going to do? Whatever the percentage is the MPC. And it's expressed as the number 1 or less. So if you spend 100% of that dollar, then the MPC is 1. And this has to do with calculating the spending multiplier. Let's look at some examples here. So if you consume 80% of every dollar that you get, the MPC is 0.8. Now you're not going to have to worry about a formula here. I'm not going to give you a formula. I'm just trying to help you understand why the government does this or the thinking behind it. If you consume 50 cents of every dollar, the MPC is 0.5. Well, the MPC is directly related to this spending multiplier that the government is trying to make happen. So the question that the government is always asking is, if I spend money, if I spend $1, how much is that producing in the economy? That's the spending multiplier. So here's what happens. Here's how this works, and this is how we figure out, or we try to figure out, how much $1 of government spending will produce in the economy to get the economy going again. Let's say the government spends $100. Let's say it buys something for $100. And let's say that the MPC, the marginal propensity to consume, is 0.8. That means you're going to spend, if you get that dollar from the government, you're going to spend $100. You get $100 from the government, you're going to spend $80. Well, the next guy that gets that $80, he's going to spend 80% of that $80, and that's 64. And the next person that gets that 64 is going to spend 80% of that, and so on down the line until the money's all gone. Well, this is why the government does this, because if you spend $100, and most people in the country that get the money are spending 80% of it, then it produces $500 in the economy. Do you see how that works? So the idea is, if you spend $2 trillion, that if people are spending 80% of what they get, then as it goes on down the line, that $2 trillion becomes $10 trillion. Now that's a big deal. If the MPC is 0.5, or you're spending half that $100, then the multiplier is 200. You don't need to remember these terms, and you don't need to remember this math. All you need to know is that when the government spends that money, the reason it's doing it is because it thinks it will multiply. But does it? That's the question, isn't it? Do stimulus plans work? In my research, I found a fascinating report done by the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. And it's called A Historical and Statistical Analysis of U.S. Fiscal Stimulus Activity from 1953 to 2011. Now I know that's a lot of big words, but basically what they did was they went back and they looked at every stimulus of every presidential administration from 1953 up to 2011, all right? Almost 60 years. And then they tried to analyze what those administrations did for stimulus and what effect it had on the economy, both in the short and the long term. It's a fascinating report. I know you'll all download it today. It's like 25 pages and you all read it. But here's what they said. This is how they concluded. This report concluded, there is no significant relationship between changes in government spending during recessions and economic growth at any point from 1 to 10 years later. In summary, regardless of the time horizon, and regardless of whether the economy is in recession or expansion, the data exhibit no evidence of stimulus spending having any effect on economic growth. What they're saying is, look, we did the analysis. We looked at what was done in each administration. We looked at the economic data. And what we found was that all the spending that the government did had no measurable effect either short-term or long-term, on the economy. 1 to 10 years later. They don't work, is what this report said. Why, though? Why did they not work? Why don't they work? Why don't they work? Let's look at some reasons the report pointed out. And again, these won't be too technical, but just hang with me and I'll explain them to you, because I want you to understand why, not just what I'm saying, but why I'm saying it. First, there is the recognition problem. Most of the time, the government can't recognize a recession, that means when the economy is going down, for 6, 12, or 18 months after it's happened. So when the government finally gets around to doing something, it's too late to make any kind of significant difference. It was needed back when the symptoms were manifesting themselves. So there's a recognition problem. And then there's a timing problem. The government takes a long time to get bills through Congress, to figure out what it needs to do, to take actions in the market, whatever. So not only do you have this recognition problem, but you also have a time, once we realize what we need to do, it takes us months to do something. So that releases or reduces the effect of the stimulus. And then there's the coordination problem. Remember, we talked about things like adjusting the money supply. We talked about things like changing regulations. We talked about things like government spending programs. All of those require all of these complex, massive government entities to get their stuff together and do things in a particular way in a particular timing. It's very difficult for the government to do that, as you can imagine. And then there's the multiplier problem. The multiplier problem simply means that the government is usually expecting the multiplier to be much higher than it actually is. I don't know about you, but I got 2 stimulus checks from my family last year, and I saved both of them. So what is my multiplier? 0. So they spent that money, but I did not spend any of it in the economy. I saved it. You see that? So we've got the multiplier problem. So in the end, stimulus plans won't work. But like free stuff, like free government giveaways, there are bigger problems that stimulus plans create. First of all is that all stimulus programs are funded by debt. Let me show you how you can tell this. Every single program is funded by debt. In 2001, the national debt was at $6 trillion. 2001 was the last time the government ran a surplus. In other words, that's the last time the government income was greater than what it spent. Every year since 2001, 20 years in a row, we have run deficits, which means we're spending more than we take in. Guess what it was in 2020? It was $27 trillion. We have added $21 trillion in debt in 20 years. That's a 450% growth of our debt. And when we get to our main sessions next Sunday and the following Sunday, which I'll be doing live at church, we're going to hammer away at this debt and see what an anchor it is around our nation and how it could end up very likely destroying us. All stimulus programs are funded by debt. This $1.9 trillion that was just passed, every single penny must be borrowed. So when you get that check, you have received money from the government that the government had to borrow to give you. That's not the only problem, though. What other problems does this constant cry for stimulus manifest in our culture? You know, people are going crazy to get that stimulus money. There are articles on the internet all the time. When are we going to get our money? When are we going to get our money? You need the money. You need the money. What is it showing? As we continue to look to government more and more to protect us, to provide for us, what is that showing? It is showing a worship of government. And this is exactly what socialism wants. The socialist wants you to look to government, the state, as God. The state is God in socialism. It makes all the decisions. It has all the income. It has all the resources. It determines who gets what and when and how. And as we become less godly of a society, with less integrity, less work ethic, and as we turn more and more to government, our first petition in the United States these days when bad things happen is not to our Creator, but to our legislators. And this is revealing, this constant call for stimulus is revealing a worship of government. And I want to remind you, God allows no one to be worshiped but Him. Another problem with stimulus plans, another thing that they manifest in our nation, Christians included, myself included, is a failure to prepare for bad times. We don't save anymore. We don't put back anymore. We live hand to mouth, check by check to check to check, paycheck to paycheck. We consume everything that we make. We borrow for boats and we spend our money on interest payments on credit cards, and we do not prepare. So when something happens and there is a run on the supermarkets, we freak out because we have not prepared. When we have unemployment, when we get laid off from a job, we look into the government, give me more money, because I have not saved to prepare for myself. But God is very much against this. Proverbs 22:3. A prudent man foresees evil and hides himself. A prudent man foresees evil and hides himself. What is it saying? It's saying that somebody who is wise is going to look out into the future and say, you know what? I may actually go on unemployment at some time. I could lose my job. Therefore, I need to hide myself. I need to put something away so that I can take care of my family if I'm unemployed. A wise man looks out there and says, hey, you know, sometimes crazy things happen in this country, in this culture, and I need to have a storage of food and gas and a generator. So I need to take some of my money today, and I need to use it to prepare for that evil, that difficulty that I see coming in the future. But when we see these stimulus plans and we see these cries for stimulus and everybody needs the money, what are we seeing? We're seeing a nation that does not prepare for itself, a nation that does not set aside anything. Ideally, a Christian should never have to take from government, even in emergencies. Did you hear that? Ideally, a Christian should never have to take from government, even in emergencies. God's Word teaches hard work, self-control, saving, and preparation for future hard times. A Christian family that practices these disciplines over the course of years should never need a handout from government, whether following a storm, during a season of unemployment, or in the case of a pandemic. While there are exceptions in a world of sin, divorce, human weakness, and catastrophe, God's Word sets the goal firmly above us. But if anyone does not provide for his own, the Lord said, and especially for those of his own household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. And in another place he said, if anyone will not work, neither shall he eat. These verses place the burden squarely on the shoulders of the believer to provide for himself and his family in every situation, and never to look for government for that which God has commanded him to supply himself. Stimulus plans, brothers and sisters, looking to the government to save us, looking for them to bail us out, is completely the opposite of God's wisdom, and it is setting us up for a catastrophe, both individually and as a nation. And then finally, what does it show about us as a nation? Stimulus plans reveal our fear of suffering. You notice how people today are scared to death for anything to go wrong. Scared to death for the economy to slow down. Scared to death that they might get unemployed, that they might get a virus, that they might get anything. People don't want to suffer at all today. We are so afraid that things are going to go wrong. But what we need to realize is that God sends trials to both individuals and nations to discipline and train them so that things can get better in the future. But we have avoided this. We do not want this. We have become such a foolish society. Psalm 119:67 says, before I was afflicted, I went astray, but now I keep your word. You see what happened here? But he said, look, I was headed astray. I was headed off course. I was headed to destruction before I was afflicted, before something bad happened. But something bad happened, and that brought me back to you and to your word. And now I keep your word, and I am no longer headed astray. The devastating results of our unbelief in this area. In the book, I have a quote here from the book. America is suffering, economically and otherwise, because it has moved away from the Creator's rules and design for life. We like to think of ourselves as somehow liberated from God's prison when we throw off the teachings of the Bible. But we only make things worse for ourselves when we do. The suffering God has been trying to bring us, pay attention to this, very critical. The suffering God has been trying to bring us through difficult economic times has been sidestepped, at least for a season, by debt. Let me pause there. What we have done is, in all of these difficulties from 9/11 to the Great Recession to the pandemic, as we have used borrowed money to keep ourselves from having to struggle. But God is intending for us to struggle because we have gone astray. We have gone so far astray, as I will show you very soon, that He is about to strike us with a death blow. He has been trying to discipline us, but we have been slipping around that discipline by borrowing money. The pain that these trials could have brought and the changes they could have worked in us would have made the future brighter. Instead, because of our foolishness, the future is bleaker than ever.